details. Now it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Marcey Hoover, our keynote for this lunch. Dr. Hoover is the Director of Quality Assurance at Sandia National Labs, where she's responsible for designing and sustaining the lab's quality assurance system and the associated technical capabilities. Dr. Hoover previously served as the Senior Manager also at Sandia, and she was responsible for developing the science and engineering underpinning efforts to predict and influence the behavior of complex, highly interacting systems critical to our nation's security posture. In her role as Senior Manager and Chief of Operations for Sandia's Energy and Climate Program, Dr. Hoover was responsible for strategic planning, financial management, business development, and communications. Dr. Hoover is an active member of the American Statistical Association as well as the American Society for Quality. She was recognized as the outstanding alumni by the Statistics Department at Purdue University in 2009. And in 2011, she was nominated for the YWCA Middle Rio Grande Women on the Move Award. Dr. Hoover received her Bachelor of Science degree in math from Michigan State University and her master's and PhD in mathematical statistics from Purdue. Please welcome me in welcoming Dr. Hoover.
Good afternoon. It's great to see all of you here, despite the snow. I recall now why I moved away from the Midwest, but it's good to feel the cold and the snow once in a while. I hope you've enjoyed the conference so far. As was mentioned in the introduction, my name is Marcey Hoover, and I'm the Director of Quality at Sandia Labs. And for those of you that are familiar with the mission of Sandia, it may not surprise you that the quality organization that I direct at Sandia has some very deep technical underpinnings and foundation. And in fact, my quality organization consists of human factors engineers, cognitive sciences, the statistical sciences, and also our measurement sciences. We have a primary standards lab. We have some deep technical expertise. And so in fact, the journey that I'm going to share with you today was actually the one that members of our statistical sciences department experienced over a good portion of the last 2 decades. It is the department that I hired into at Sandia 23 years ago as a young statistician, and I am pleased to report that the department continues under some very strong leadership of Dr. Justin Newcomer. Some of you may know Justin. He's sitting over there, and I'd like to thank Justin for his help in putting together this talk. So today, we're going to talk about a journey that we took. And my words that I'm going to share without giving away everything is, be careful of what you ask for. Alrighty, so I'm going to give you a little bit of history about Sandia. For those of you that are already familiar with the lab, please bear with me. It's one slide, and then we'll jump into the meat of things. So Sandia actually has its roots that go way back to the Manhattan Project of World War II. We actually began in 1945 as an arm of Los Alamos, which you're all familiar with. And we were the arm of Los Alamos that was responsible for the ordnance, design, testing, and assembly. But in 1949, the decision was made to break Sandia off as its own national lab. And in fact, how it came to be was that President Harry Truman made somewhat of a patriotic plea to the president of AT&T Bell Labs and said, you know, in my opinion, you have here an opportunity to render an exceptional service in the national interest. And really that remains our motto at Sandia. In fact, it's on the back of all of our business cards, an exceptional service in the national interest. And we really have stayed true to that statement for the last 70 years. And before I get into describing a little bit about what Sandia does, maybe I'll give you a little bit of a trivia test here. Raise your hand if you know what Sandia means or where the name was derived from. A couple of you do? Okay, good. Well, you'll learn something besides statistics today. How many of you have been to Albuquerque, New Mexico before, which is our main site? All righty. So you can see a little bit in the picture the outline of the mountain range behind Albuquerque. We're nestled at the foot of the Sandia Mountains, and so the big mystery in Sandia National Labs, well, the Sandia Mountain Range is what's in Albuquerque. And maybe to go a little bit deeper on that, does anybody know what the word Sandia means in Spanish? Okay, it means watermelon. If you've ever been in Albuquerque when the sun's setting, the granite in the Sandia Mountains glows kind of this pinkish, reddish orange that looks like the inside of a watermelon. So if you don't remember anything else about my talk, you can just remember where the watermelon lab. So here we are, 70 years later after Sandia started, and we've really evolved. We're the largest Department of Energy national lab. We have about 12,000 people on staff. We provide the government and other agencies about $3 billion worth of support every year. And we maintain true to our original mission, which was stewardship of the nuclear weapons stockpile, and in particular, the design of the non-nuclear components. But we also now have diversified and provide support to the nation in support of energy programs, homeland security programs, defense programs. But all those things have kind of a common theme, and that common theme is that they're high consequence, they're complex issues to deal with, they have a lot of similarities with, I know, many of the work and the technologies and the solutions that all of you also engage in. And I like to kind of draw an analogy with the type of work that we do, and I bet this will ring true to some of you as well, about the type of challenges that we have and why data is so important. The analogy I like to use is, imagine buying a car in the 1960s, and some of us can remember the 60s better than others, but you park it in your garage, you give it some regular maintenance, maybe an oil change, maybe a new battery, but you never drive it. Sometime 30 or 40 years later, you want to go out, you want to start that car up, and you want to take it for a drive, and you expect it's going to start on the first try, which is kind of unrealistic, right? But the reality is that's what we expect of a lot of our national security products. They're going to sit idle, they're going to sit in extreme environments, but yet we want them to be ready at a minute's notice. And so think about that in comparison to this car, which is kind of an interesting story behind it. A 1969 Acapulco Blue Boss 302, the owner bought it, prepped it for drag racing, drove it 132 miles, unfortunately passed away, left it in his garage. Some 30 or 40 years later, his widow went out, uncovered it, and they didn't try and drive it, they put it on the truck, but it sat idle for all of those years, but they still didn't expect it to start. But we expect our products to start. So think if you're trying to, at the beginning of the lifetime of this Mustang, decide what data you want to collect and what you need to know in order to provide absolute assurance that every time you go out and start it 30 or 40 years later, it's going to start. That's kind of a challenge. But you know what? For a lot of us, it gets even harder than that, because not only do you want to go out and start it every time, you don't want anybody else to ever start it. And at Sandia, and some of you may kind of have heard reference to this, there's this additional challenge, especially when it comes to thinking about the data you need to have assurance that not only will your Mustang always start, but it will never start unless you authorize it to work. And so this is actually a kind of an engineering challenge that at Sandia we've coined as kind of the always never challenge. You always want something to work when you want it to work. You never want it to work when you don't want it to work. And in fact, the story that I usually tell to kind of give people a little bit of an understanding of what we mean by this is a story that actually goes back to the mid-60s. And some of you may be familiar with this. In 1966, I think was the year, a B-52 collided with a KC-135 during a mid-air refueling mission. They were at 31,000 feet. They were flying above the coast of Spain. Unfortunately, the KC-135 caught on fire, ignited, all the crew members died. The B-52 broke apart. Fortunately, 4 of the crew members were able to parachute to safety. The other 3 did not make it. But there were some other passengers on this B-52. There was 4 nuclear weapons. This was the time when there was regular alert flying around the world. And all 4 of those weapons fell 31,000 feet to the ground. 3 of them landed near a small fishing village called Palomar, Spain. 1 of them fell into the Mediterranean Ocean. And the first picture you see up on the screen on the left is actually the recovery of that 1 weapon from the Mediterranean Sea. But guess what? None of those 4 worked. They never worked. They didn't work where intended. It wasn't intended that just because something fell thousands of feet that you'd actually have it function. And it didn't. And at the time, a lot of that security and that safety was based on subject matter knowledge. The middle picture that you see up on the screen, actually, the bombs that those gentlemen are standing next to was one of the ones that was recovered from the sea. You can look and see at the dent on the end, it's the same indentation. If you're ever in Albuquerque, there's actually a museum of nuclear history where these are on display. That's where that picture was taken. But at the time, we relied heavily on the subject matter expertise to assure that things were never going to work. But fast forward, here we are, 40 or 50 years later. We still rely on our subject matter expertise, but now we get a whole bunch of data, right? I know many of you are involved in testing operations. They're highly orchestrated events, heavy data collection. And so thinking about what the environment looks like today, I just want to show you a video of a typical flight test and just think about what it means to actually have data that comes from a test like this.
Attention on range control, aircraft 10 minutes out, anticipating hot pass.
That's kind of important. Okay, so think about that, right? In the past, 50, 60 years ago, we had a lot of subject matter expertise. We now, right, have moved into a point in time where we get lots of data. I like to show that video because my first manager job at Sandia was managing all of the testing up at Tonopah Test Range, and it still was one of the coolest jobs a statistician can ever have to see data actually being collected. But our challenge, right, statisticians and practitioners of data, is how do you influence the engineering community to actually look at all of that data? How do you actually absorb it? So that's what the journey story is about, because at Sandia, actually, it took a flight test that didn't go quite as smoothly as the one that you just saw. And so the journey and where we're going to start kind of talking about how you get to a data-centric part actually had to do with a flight test that in the late 1990s didn't go so well. We had a failure. We had an electrical signal that failed to pass through a key component. And as a result, it prompted a review of all the data that we had collected, right? We were in a position where we actually had collected the data. We could actually access the data. We just hadn't been looking at it. And what we uncovered was a very complex jet fin interaction. I'm not a aero person, and so no questions are allowed to get asked about the counter torque and how that works up there. You can Google it or I'll connect you with somebody. But the point being that there was a very complex interaction that was taking place with some of our flight bodies. And we didn't expect it. It was a big surprise. And as many of you know, when you have a large test failure, it really makes everybody perk up. And in fact, what we found as we looked at the data was we'd been performing tests, but of course it didn't cover the entire delivery envelope. It's just not possible to test every possible combination or to test all components. We collected data, but oftentimes we didn't have the resources or weren't actually reducing it and looking at it. And so what happened? Well, we didn't understand the worst case conditions. And really it was this failure that really prompted everybody to start thinking about how do we actually start using that data? How do we actually drive to an approach where we're basing decisions on data? And so that's kind of the key point here, was that we had this thing that got everybody's attention that all of a sudden focused all attention on looking at the data. And again, be careful of what you ask for, because what we saw was a ton of upper management support that said, okay, we're going to change our culture. We're going to take a proactive approach to looking at our data. And over the course of about a decade, we saw three things that actually came into being. One was a practice where we had critical performance parameters that were more thoroughly defined. They were documented for each system. We had our statisticians, Justin and team, were out collaborating with people. They were helping them make sure that the data we collected covered the design space. We were actually looking at the data and analyzing it. When we had new systems that were being designed, we had expectations and requirements that they would actually document their worst case conditions. They would collect data that would cover this. We actually finally got to a point of where we had our engineering teams were doing some quantitative type of analysis to try and understand their margins and the uncertainties. So we thought we'd kind of come to nirvana, right? What else do we want as statisticians for people to be identifying those key metrics, actually planning their data collection, validating requirements, using that data to actually quantify their margins and the uncertainties? Well, this is kind of where the story starts going in the opposite direction. We got to a point of where people were actually having expectations and requirements to drive decisions based on data. But guess what happened? Came to a revelation. And I can say this as a statistician because you won't throw tomatoes at me since I'm up here. As an engineer, that might not be true, but statistics isn't a magical solution, right? We'd gotten to a point in this journey where we really had the engineering community stepping up to the table and trying to make statements about confidence levels and tolerance intervals. And Justin shared a story with me in the graph that you may not be able to read, but I'll describe it to you, was sort of this turning point where we had all of our engineering teams that were creating tolerance intervals, and at a certain review that Justin was at, someone showed this graph. And they said, yep, we've done our tolerance interval. We're 95% confident that our 99% normal tolerance interval is this, and we've tested 43 units. So does anybody see anything wrong with that picture? They'd already had a failure. Something was already out of the tolerance limits. And so, right, people were starting to kind of blindly apply some of these statistical methods. And for those of you that are professionals in this area, it's not going to surprise you. It's because that uncertainty bug bought us, right? There's a whole list of bullets up on the screen that, right, we had test data measurement uncertainty, we had model uncertainty, we had the experts not fully understanding their systems, we had the inability to separate some of that inherent variability out. We weren't able to quantify all the variabilities. And so we had pushed our culture to a part of where they were looking at data, they were using it, but it really had taken us beyond what the intended destination on our journey was. And in fact, let me kind of share with you what happened over about a decade-long time frame at Sandia. We started off, as I showed with those gray beards that were standing over that bomb that dropped in Palomar, Spain, with a culture that was very subject matter expertise driven. I think the term that was used this morning was the calibrated eye, right? And some of the time that's a really good thing. But we were very reliant on the judgment of subject matter experts. Their engineering experience was invaluable. But as things shifted over time, we started to disregard this valuable test data. And also, right, people retire, people leave. And so we had come to a place in kind of the 2000s where we started to look at some margin analysis, but really all we had to work with was this go, no-go data. We had that flight test that I shared with you, the failure that happened in the late 90s, where we actually had some executive level championship to try and actually look at data. We had our physics labs partners, Los Alamos and Lawrence Livermore, that were standing up approaches for looking at margins and uncertainties. And in about the 2006 timeframe, we'd started on this journey over to the right of this chart, moving towards something that was more data-driven, where decisions were based on data. We had broad testing. We had a lot of data we could pull on. And we actually had our chief engineer that issued a memo that said, you know, for this year's assessment and review, we do an annual look at the nuclear weapons stockpile. I want this handful of major components to actually do a margin and uncertainty analysis. We did. We had statisticians involved. It all made sense. Well, guess what? It worked so well. Be careful what you ask for. The next year, we had guidance from our chief engineer. All right, do this broadly. Everybody should do this. Well, that's when things started to go wrong and where we went off track on our journey. Because what we found was that our technical guidance as statisticians and data practitioners was lagging behind the executive leadership, which is a little bit different than what we typically experience as statisticians. And we had our leadership out saying, you should go do this, you should look at your data. And what happened was we ended up way over there on the right-hand side of that graph in an area where we had an expectation that everybody applied some of these techniques. But in fact, there's only 10 or 20 statisticians at Sandia, and it's a 12,000 person organization. And so we started moving in that direction of having simplistic tools available to our engineering community, which, as we all know, the data that we deal with is not simplistic. And so we got to a point way over on the right-hand side where we didn't have the technical guidance keeping up with the executive guidance. We had people that were doing things that really was overly simplified. And we realized we needed to get back somewhere. So that's kind of where this journey changed. We actually found ourselves, ironically, in a position to have to try and pull back to a position where we were more centered around data. We weren't driving everything with data, nor were we way over on the left-hand side entirely dependent on subject matter expertise. And again, much as it took executive leadership to say you should start doing this, we also needed to have some leadership or someone with some clout to say, okay, stop doing this a little bit. And in fact, although we had our statisticians that were trying to push that, what it really took was a formal red team review that came in and said, okay, let's think about this and let's review this approach that we have to margin and uncertainty analysis. And so we started being able to kind of have that pendulum swing back to the middle with a fairly large red team review. And at the same time, we had our statisticians working with our chief engineer's office to try and tone down the language a little bit and say, yeah, you should be doing these types of analyses, but you also need to understand the data and where it came from. And so what we did was, on this chart, nothing changed from the left to the right. We actually pushed to get back to a more, what I call a data-centric type of approach, where we had a greater touch by the statisticians. We had both qualitative and quantitative type of data used in decision making. We actually published a margin and uncertainty handbook, which still was very heavy on the statistical tools, so it didn't quite get us there. A couple years later, we're now kind of circa 2015, we put out a revised handbook that talks not only about the statistical tools, but the expert judgment. And so our journey, what it really took us on is it took us way to the extreme side, and we've kind of come back to this middle ground where we in fact have kind of this mix of the subject matter expertise and kind of that data-driven evidence. And I think one of the important things, or the thing to share here, is that we've evolved some of our guidance to our engineering teams to have both of these things be elements. And so what you see up on the screen is actually the evidence package that our systems at the top level require components to bring to them. And it's things that really are based on data. So it's things like sample size and means and standard deviations, ranges of performance, measures of uncertainty, an actual visualization of the data. So all things that are very much kind of back to kind of the basic statistics and the basic data, but we try and temper that with also telling people, okay, talk to us about your engineering judgment that you applied. And so we actually ask people, okay, well tell us, were these units representative? Do you expect to see any changes in production? What about when you look at different use conditions or different environments? What's the measurement error that you see? Did you have any outliers? What did you do to understand those outliers or anomalies? What are other sources of uncertainties that maybe you haven't taken into account that could impact your margin? And then, perhaps most importantly, what other engineering judgment or past data do you actually have access to that might support or refute some of your margin assertions? And so we've moved to a place that's kind of this data-centric approach, and what's been somewhat magical about this is that we actually have the systems organizations, which are kind of at the top of the food chain, right, that kind of dictate things. They're actually the ones that are advocating and championing all of this. And so as we've kind of went through this journey, one of the things that we learned was that, right, we as statisticians can try and influence the decision makers, we can guide them on the type of data that they want, but really to go down on that journey and get to where you want to, it takes some executive championship, it takes some leadership, it takes someone that can actually help influence that. And so, we feel that we're at a place of where now we're applying engineering analysis that sometimes uses statistics, but not vice versa, which is kind of where we got to in our journey that maybe went a little bit too far. And, right, we try and advocate that the good engineering judgment, right, should always trump unvalidated statistical assumptions, because the reality is the type of data that we deal with, right, it's complex, there's a lot of uncertainties. We think this is the appropriate place for us to be at this time, but we're not happy with it. We're not totally satisfied. And so, we are looking at some other research topics to try and close the gap and maybe, swing that pendulum a little bit back towards the data-centric part. And so I know there's a couple of talks by some of my colleagues, and if not, would welcome you to kind of touch base with any of the folks that are here about, what are we doing in terms of future research thrusts. A lot of it has to do with how you combine data from different levels, different sources. And so we've got some people that are working on data fusion in terms of how do you bring together some of the fundamental experimental types of results as well as the data that you collect from surveillance or other testing. We have some efforts that are ongoing in terms of how do you have more data-driven statistical model and involve modeling simulation and integrate some information from all different levels of the weapons assembly. We're asking ourselves, Questions about intelligent data collection, right? How can we actually collect information-rich data to position us to be able to answer tomorrow's questions, right? A lot of the questions we deal with is not just about today, it's about tomorrow or 10 years from now or 20 years from now. Predictive aging, right? Probably something that's on the top of a lot of your lists. How do we actually integrate information across the entire life cycle of a component or weapon system, from design, qualification, production, up until surveillance? And finally, one of the tracks that I know is on the agenda around human factors. How do we actually improve our decision-making process by improving access to information, improving communication to reduce decision uncertainty? So our journey has taken us to a place where we think it's appropriate for where we're at. We think there's more work to be done. I think the meetings like this today are helping us to sort through some of these types of questions, and I think it's going to help us take us further down that road on that journey, and we look forward to being a part of it with all of you, given the similarities that we have. And so I want to kind of wrap up by just not only saying thank you, but just, themes from the talk is, right, sometimes we have to be careful what we ask for. We all need executive leadership. We need someone that has clout. Some of the time it all takes a test failure or something to get some attention on things. But our job, right, is really to kind of keep our technical leadership and our technical guidance and that pace kind of consistent with that executive leadership. That was one of our big lessons learned from this journey. And in the end, right, again, right, it's our job to help the decision makers better understand what data they should be asking for, how they balance that subject matter expertise with the data. And in the end, hopefully you'll think about some of those things as you all go on your own journey through your organizations. And if there's any questions that we or my team can answer on this, I'd be happy to do so. I know we have another session coming up, but I'm fine for a couple of questions if anybody has them. Thank you.